Welcome everyone for the second edition of our webinar. The duration of this webinar will be for 30 minutes. Thank you everybody for joining this webinar and also the previous one. NEDAP as an organization has been doing access control for a long time, close to 40 years, and the objective or as a result, the objective of this webinar is to share our experiences that we've gained over the years from an access control standpoint. And this webinar is directed towards a wide audience of anybody who's primarily interested in access control or to any access control enthusiast. Yeah, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask them during the course of the webinar, and we'll try to answer them at the question and answer session at the end. And if there are additional questions, we would of course get back to you through an email at a later point in time. Yeah. On that note, without much further ado, let me begin the learn session, as we'd like to call it. And of course, you can consider this learn session like a sequel to a very nice Hollywood movie. Of course, the judge of the movie is you guys. So let's presume that it has a good ending. So the title of this webinar is Introduction to Access Control Part 2. And Part 1 we already covered in a previous learn session. Before I introduce to the beautiful world of access control, let me briefly introduce everybody to me. So my name is Anand. I am the business development manager and I handle a few territories in the Middle East. In addition, I also advise clients from an access control perspective in particular, and also from a security standpoint as well. And this is my 5th year at NEDAP. And if you have any questions, of course, you can reach out to me through my email, or you can reach out to me using my LinkedIn page. And together today, I have with me my another wonderful colleague.
Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Błażej Ożga, a consultant and client manager in Poland. I have been working in access control and security market for over 15 years, and I've been with NEDAP at 3 years. And I'm really passionate about new technology in security market, especially in access control system. And you can catch me on this my email address. Let's go.
Perfect, Błażej. Thanks. For everybody there who attended the previous webinar, you would have known that there are poll questions at different junctures in this webinar, just to make the webinar more interactive and to get a feel of what you think. And bear in mind, these questions are completely anonymous, so your honest feedback is at most appreciated. Which brings me to the first poll question of the day, which is, I would like to understand the audience that I'm talking to. So could you please respond to this question? Perfect. So I see a mix and match, and I'm happy nobody is retired in this audience. So that's a good start, and that's the good news. Okay. On that note, let me quickly begin. All right, quickly moving on. And for everybody who attended the previous webinar, and also for the new audience who are attending this webinar, a brief recap of what we did during the last webinar. In the last webinar, it was a pretty fundamental webinar, wherein we looked at what is access control, or why do we need access control. We looked at RFID and the relationship with access control, wired access control and related components, anti-passback, and last but not the least, vehicle access control. Yeah, and we promised that we would touch base on a little more advanced topics during this webinar. Again, fundamental topics, but nonetheless a little more technical aspects. And so in this webinar, we will look at wireless access control, advanced security features, which include key cabinets, my personal favorite, with some interesting examples, cabling and the fundamentals of cabling and wiring, and access control server basics. Yeah. So these are some of the topics that we'll be looking forward to in this webinar. And in order for us to begin, let's begin from the architecture again, a familiar image for access control audience. Again, here, this is basically the architecture of access control, and we are looking at the door level because we're going to look at what is wireless access control. Yeah, And talking about wireless access control, again, I'm curious to understand how many of you or how many of your clients have used wireless online or offline access control? Okay. Oh, interesting. So 60% or 59% of the audience knows what is wired and or have used wired, and there is 30% who haven't, and there are some who say 7% who say they stick with wired. Okay, interesting feedback. And after the end of this end of few slides, I will explain, or I'm presuming you will have the answer of when you can use wired and when you can use wireless. Yeah. So let us begin with wireless online access control. All right, perfect. So I'm going to use a pretty easy example just so everybody understands how wireless online system works. So let's presume I am entering inside a building and there is a glass door which is having a wireless reader over there, and I have authorization to this door, but I need to use that a card to open the door. So what I do, I take my card, I go to the door, I present my card, and as you can see, the dotted line represents the information being sent wirelessly to what is called as a wireless hub. Yeah. On the left hand side, you see the wired access control diagram, and you can clearly see a physical layer, such as a cable connected between the reader and the controller. In the case of the wireless system, as the name itself is synonymous, there is no physical wiring between the wireless reader and the hub, and the information is exchanged wirelessly, and the hub is connected to the controller, which is the brain of the access control system, by means of an IP connectivity or other connections depending on the type of hub that you choose. Yeah. And so just to put it in layman's terms, wireless access control or wireless online access control sends the information wirelessly, and it's online because you get real-time feedback. It's pretty much like wired online system, only difference without a wire. Yeah. And let's look at the components involved in a wireless system. So if you take a wireless reader, there are different form factors of wireless readers. You have a cylinder, you have handle, you have escutcheons, and few others. And you choose the wireless type or wireless cylinder or handle or escutcheon depending on the type of door. All right. And of course, because it's an online system, you also need an online hub. And this hub is the intermediate, let's say, hardware that interfaces wirelessly between the reader and the controller. All right. And also, again, choice of hubs depends from a manufacturer to manufacturer, and they provide different functionality. And if you need, or if you have more questions on the same, please reach out to me and I can help you with my recommendations. Yeah. This is regarding wireless access control online. And now let's look at an example of wireless offline system. And for wireless offline, I'm going to use another simple example, and something most of you would have already experienced, which is everybody going to a hospitality environment, wherein you'd go to a hotel for a vacation, you would go to a receptionist and say, I have my reservation, I need access to a suite. And then they would say, okay. They would take a card, put it on a desktop reader connected, or a reader connected to the system, and they would give the card back. So what happens here is the card is being stored with some information, so the card has some information inside, and this reader in access control terminologies is called as an updater. And then they hand over the card. You go to your room, for instance 102, you present the card to the reader, and the handshake between the reader and the card happens locally, and hence the name offline, because there is no active feedback sent to the, let's say, the controller right away. All right. So you use the card, you enter inside your room, and if you're wondering, all right, that is not so convenient because I would also like to know who is accessing and where he's accessing. How this happens is when you return the card back to the receptionist, they again take the card, put it on the reader in their desk, and then the information from the card is retrieved and is used for audit purposes. Yeah. So this is wireless access control offline. And to answer your poll question, if you are looking at a secure environment that has a little more leeway in terms of budget, you can you or your I would advise you to use wireless online. But if you're looking for instance, an hospitality environment, of course you can use offline system. But again, the use cases vary, and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to help you. As far as the components for wireless uh, online wireless offline system is concerned, let me give you an example. Again, the reader is pretty much the same. Yeah, you can use a cylinder, handle, and an escutcheon. So there's no difference from a reader standpoint. Yeah. And if you're wondering, you're talking about offline, Anand, and there's no wireless hub. How does the communication happen between the wireless between the reader and the controller? It happens through open standards, just like how you have open standards in wired reader, which is vgond and osdp, something that we discussed in the previous webinar. You have open standards that is not owned by a proprietary vendor. It's called open standard for a reason, which means it provides interoperability between a multitude of systems that belongs to access control manufacturers and wireless manufacturers. Yeah. So this is in a nutshell about wireless online and offline system. And let my colleague Blazej explain about some advanced features. Blazej.
Thank you very much, Anand. So let's move on to something different. I mean something which is from mechanical and electronic world at the same time. I'm thinking specifically about key cabinets. You can always face up with the situation that using mechanical keys are mandatory in the building, because in many situations you cannot eliminate keys. That's why probably you may want to manage them. So key cabinets are devices which can help you to manage keys on your facility. They use electronic fobs to make sure that keys are in proper socket or not. Of course, this device lets you take only those keys which you have an access. How this device looks like, you can see on the screen. And at this place, I would like to ask you with this poll question, which is, how many of you uh, are aware about integration with key cabinets and access control system? Great, interesting. As I can see that 66% of you doesn't know aware that there are integration between access control and key cabinets. Yes, there are. And let me explain you how it works in practice. So integration between access control and key cabinets are able to allow you to keep track of who has which mechanical keys. Basically, via access control software, you can easily authorize which people can pick up which keys. What is more, you can inform these persons by sending to them a notification, for instance, to mobile phone, and inform that they haven't returned the key or keys. And it is up to you, for example, to block the person if they didn't do it. And that means that they won't be able to leave the facility until they return the key back to the key cabinets. Then this person will be allowed to exit the facility. All right, and now I want to explain a little bit more about controller level. Let me explain what is the device exactly. As you may know, the controller is like a small brain among the rest of the physical devices which are installed at the door. In other words, it is a small computer which is make decision who is allowed to enter or and who is not. Of course, this is only one of the control functions. It is also responsibility for communication with the readers, servers, modules, and preparing encryptions and providing logical functions. So as you can see, the controller normally has a lot to do so. So let's go deeper. As we explained before, all devices at door level that we have discussed so far are connected to the controller or modules. Because we are discussing about wired door, all are connected with wires. As I explained it to you, the controller plays such a crucial role. That's why it shouldn't be installed at the secure side of the building. And how the readers are connected to the controller or modules. Basically, it depends on the protocol which you use. It could be RS485, For instance, also OSDP, which we mentioned, communicates over RS485, of course. And this is case you need to use 4 wires. 2 wires, for instance, for data bus and 2 wires for powered. Of course, these cables should be shielded and these cables should be twisted. Why twisted? Because we have to avoid communication failures. If you want to connect the reader via VGANT, the total number which you have to use, total number of wires which you have to use depends on the functionality which you want to achieve with the readers. For instance, if you want to steering green LED or red LED and the same time buzzer, you have to have minimum 3 wires and 2 more for powering, 1 more from tamper, and 2 more for data communications. Regarding to cabling, it's always good to ask your, for instance, partners. And of course, we have to connect other devices such as door monitor and other signal like contact from a request to exit button or contact from emergency button, because we want to make sure that we know who or if this emergency exit button was pushed. So that's why we have to also cabling these devices. If we are talking about powering, this output cabling depends on the log that is connected to it. Also, it is common that the log is powered independently of the controller. And in this situation, the cables go through the emergency exit button to allow for cutting the power in the case of emergency. This means unlocking the door in emergency situation does not depend on the controller. Of course, fire alarm system also can cut the power in case of emergency situation. All right, and now I will give the floor to Anand.
Thanks, Blazej. I think that was interesting feedback, especially the explanation pertaining to again OSDP and VGAN, which is something we touched base in a previous webinar, and it explains the importance of using OSDP and the advantages potentially one can get. Yeah. All right. Now coming to the topic at hand, which is my favorite topic, which is about master and slave units. Yeah. If you look at an access control system, the brain of the access control system is the intelligent control, right? And then you also have additional door modules, which include what is called as a door interface module, or in again, you can also call this as subcontroller. Yeah. And also you have something called as input output interface or IO modules. Yeah. And if you're wondering what this is, I will briefly explain what it does. The intelligent controller, as the name suggests, is the intelligent guy in a class. So he or the controller can take independent decisions on its own, right? However, the door interface is similar to an intelligent controller from an interfacing standpoint, which means it can take in similar number of hardware peripherals. However, he is a little bit like me. I mean, he's dependent on the intelligent guy to take decisions. So the subcontroller basically is reliant on the intelligent controller for any decisions. And same goes for an input output module. The difference between an input output module, or in some systems, input module and output module, is that the subcontroller can take in inputs and outputs like door monitoring devices, locks, buzzers, etc. But the input output interface can also do the same, but it cannot interface card readers. Yeah. So this is the difference between a door interface module and an input output interface. Being one can take in card readers and the other cannot, and of course input output interface has more inputs and outputs. So if you have areas where you need to use more inputs and outputs, then you can use an input output interface in that case. And of course all of these devices are dependent on the intelligent controller for decision making, and it happens by using what is called as an RS485 let's say standard, which is a standard that defines the electrical characteristics of devices and drivers for use in serial communication. Yeah. And this sounds like a lot of gibberish, but it's actually very simple. And if you'd like to know, please touch base with me and I'll be happy to explain what it means. Now, Of course, you can connect a number of devices to a controller connected via RS485 bus, and it depends on the manufacturer how many devices that you want to connect, right? If you look at the cabling that you'd want to use, in my experience, at least, you can use different cables. You can use Cat 5e, Cat 6. Pretty much in the Middle East, we predominantly use Category 6 cables, or at least the business partners use them. So you can use different cables from a cabling standpoint. And again, for RS485, you use 2 wires of shielded cable in order for the communication to happen from the controller to the subcontroller modules. And if you're wondering, again, a very common question, okay, RS485 is standard. What is the distance that I can connect the intelligent controller and the last subcontroller? So for example, if you have, let's say, a mall facility or a massive area, and if you take a floor, the floor would be pretty big. So if you're having an intelligent controller on one end, you can connect up to, in theory, 1200 meters from the intelligent controller to the last door module. But I would recommend to connect up to 1000 meters, because 1200 is in theory, but in practice, my experience is that you stick to 1000 meters so that you don't face any losses, or you don't face any challenges from a communication standpoint. And this distance is not something that is designated by a company. It's a standard that RS485 provides. All right. Now, again, another $1 million question that a lot of people would be wondering is the usage of controllers and door interface modules. When should I use a controller? When should I use a door interface module or a subcontroller? Yeah. The answer for this question is, of course, very relative. So the usage of these hardware will vary from project to project. Sometimes there would be some defense or critical infrastructure installations in oil and gas, defense, military, police, etc., wherein they would want to use the number of intelligent controllers more. Primarily due to the reason that the controller has the intelligence and the rate of failure is less. However, for a budgetary client who would like to use for whom a budget is of essence, of course, you can use a mix and match of controllers and door interface modules. Bear in mind the rate of failure for these devices with pretty much most conventional access control systems are predominantly less. However, the usage depends on the site and the project and the variables that come along with it. Yeah. Again, if you have further questions, please feel free to let me know, and we'll be happy to help you out with that. Yeah. Power. So how do I power these hardware? So you can power these hardware using external power supplies, 12 or 24 volt DC power standard power supply with, let's say if you're only connecting a controller, then you can use a 0.5 to a 0.5 amp or 1 amp power supply. But if you're connecting readers along with it, then you might want to check the data sheet of the controller, whichever controllers you're using, in order to understand what is the power supply that is required to a controller if you're also adding the peripherals onto the controller. At the same time, there are also controllers which support what is called as PoE, which stands for Power over Ethernet, which means the controller will be powered from the switch itself. Yeah. Although PoE controllers, PoE powers the controller, it doesn't hurt to also use an external power supply. But having a PoE based controller is always an advantage, because there's you also get a power supply from the PoE switch, and also you can use an external power supply. Yeah. And it's the same thing that is explained in this slide as well. Now, again, another interesting installation aspect is about placement of these devices. Yeah. So in an installation, where do I place these devices? Do I place it centrally or decentrally? And I will explain briefly my recommendations of what I would recommend to do. So if I had the option to choose, the first option that you can go for is a central placement, which means all the intelligent controllers, subcontrollers, and IO modules can be placed in one central location. All right. So typically, if you want to see what this means in practice, if you have a server room or an IDF room, you would want to place these devices inside that particular location so that the devices are not easily accessible by anybody, And even if somebody needs to have access, they need to have access inside the server room. So this is of course the ideal way. However, ideal scenarios not always happen. There would be cases due to, for instance, cabling constraints or a multitude of reasons wherein you cannot, or you do not happen to place these devices in one single place. In that case, of course, you can also place these devices on top of your door, by probably on your false ceiling, within an enclosure, in a place where it's not easily accessible by anybody, so it should be a little bit far away so that people do not tamper with these hardware, all the cables. All right. And how does this look in practice? So basically you have different locations, different doors, so you can place these devices on top of these doors, which brings me to the to my poll question. In your projects, or in your potential end users projects, where do you centralize these door modules? Okay, 35% says yes, 10% says no, 53 says it differs per location. Yeah, I thought as much that this would be the case. However, if you ask my personal recommendation, my first option, it would be, of course, to place it in an IDF room, provided all the challenges are not there. However, that would not be the case. So if you're placing it on top of a false ceiling, please make sure it's in an enclosure and it's not easily accessible by anybody, so that the security system works pretty well. Yeah. All right. Now,
You
Blažej.
haven't yeah, thank you. And you haven't mentioned the server locations. So this is the place where normally server is installed. And this brings us to the last but not least level of the architecture of access control system, which is server level. And server is necessary in access control system. Thanks to it, you are able to manage authorization or configuring in the system. A good access control system provides you flexibility to work with both Windows and Linux server environments. It also should provide access to the system via a standard web browser, and that means that you don't need to install local software on the client's computers. Access control shouldn't rely on the server for decision making, who is allowed to enter and who is not. You can easily imagine the situation when the server is down, for instance. Access control system should work normally without any problems. So that's why the data between server and the controllers must synchronize all the time, of course, in both ways, from the server to the controllers, everything about authorizations, from the controllers to the server, information about the events, who, when, and where opens or not the doors. But what could happen if the server is really offline? As I said before, access control system should work normally, and in good access control system, the controllers are capable of working in peer-to-peer mode, peer-to-peer communication. All functionality can continue in normal way. Of course, in this situation, if the server is down or if there are no communication with it. And this brings me to another pool question. How many of you are aware that controller can function autonomously without communication with the server? Okay, interesting. It's very good that 86% of you knows that it can communicate normally and can work normally without communication with the server. And for sure, for those 13%, yes, controller should work autonomously, definitely. And you can see that in this particular case, for instance, even if the entire IP network is down, controller must be able to work with the latest version of the database and provide access to the zones, doors, or buildings. All right, so now I would like to move your attention to the final point. So during these two webinars, we have seen that electronic access control is based on who can enter, where, when, and on which circumstances. So let's go back again to the picture which presents an architecture of the access control system and briefly recap it. So who means a person, vehicles, and we can use many types of identifiers to recognize them. At the door level, which means where. And where means all of these devices, peripherals, which are connected to the controller level. And finally, when means server level, when we manage authorization. So we decide who can enter, when, and where. We can manage all these things via the server. And it was a really pleasure talking to you all. And thank you very much for your attention. I will give the floor to Anand, my colleague Anand again.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Blazej, for summing it up. Like Blazej rightly mentioned, we've come to the end of the presentation, guys, and I know we overshooted the presentation with a couple of minutes, but we're gonna wrap it up now. Um, Again, this presentation is a basis, or it's a fundamental, it's the fundamentals of access control system. So this doesn't go, or we don't dive in depth about the various possibilities that you can potentially do with a good access control system in your premises. And there, and the access control world is pretty big, and I can say you that from experience. So, and there is a lot of possibilities, and I know there would be a lot of questions for a lot of you guys, which brings me to the last webinar question. Did you find this information to be useful? Please let me know. And again, the polling is anonymous, guys, so please share your honest feedback so that we can try to iterate and improve the content accordingly if you deem, if you have some feedback over there. All right, nice. Okay, that's 85% say that it was useful, 2% say it's too technical, and 13% say it's basic. So for the ones who found it useful, thank you. I'm glad that you liked it. For the ones who found this to be basic, bear in mind we have a series of webinars planned, and of course we're going to give a little bit of break, given the fact that there are holidays coming up. So given the fact that there are holidays coming up, so there would be a little bit of time given for the next webinar. Uh, please follow our LinkedIn handles or our website for more information on when we plan to do the next series of webinars. And we'll quickly take a couple of questions because we're already over by 4 minutes, just to try and see.
What should be the distance between server and controller? I can explain. Basically, the server is the normal EPC, which are connected to the controller via IP. So the distance, it's not a limit in the distance regarding to the IP network. So this is our question answers for these questions. And there are a couple of others.
And there is a question from Vladislav Zukov who says, does NEDAP have a single unit IP controller combined with reader like HID and others? This is a very NEDAP oriented question, but still I'll answer this question. So NEDAP of course has a IP controller, and of course it provides interoperability between HID readers, if that answers your question. Rajay, do you want to take another one?
Wait a moment, if I see something.
Okay, there's one from DN who says, aware of key cabinets integrated with ACS, just don't use them. All right, well noted. But in the event you want to use a key cabinet with ACS, there are some pretty cool things that you can do, like what Blazej mentioned. Yeah.
Mhm.
So
And we have another one. It is required access control failover server. Um, yes or not. Many times we can use default tools which are available on the market, like clusters of the servers, like virtualization, etc., and so on. So in some cases, some manufacturers just provide some failover server, some not. It depends on the manufacturers.
yeah, and one last question for the day. There's one from Adri Uzimans, if I pronounce your name correctly. He is asked, do hotels only use offline? The answer is no, of course. But hotels predominantly uses offline, but hotels also have what is called as the front of the house and back of the house. And back of the house use wired access control, and front of the house uses wireless. But most of them, yes, they do use offline, but there are few who also uses online. It depends on the client. Yeah. All right, guys. On that note, it's time for us to bid adieu. Like I said, thank you so much for attending and patiently going through both the webinars. And I hope you like this webinar. And we look forward with the next series of webinars that would be more informative. And the idea is that you take away quite a bit from an access control standpoint at the end of the day. Thank you for your time, and thank you, Blazej, for
Thank you very
partnering with me.
much, all of you, and thank you, Anand.
Yeah, see you all in the next webinar. Thank you, guys.
See you all. Bye.